Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hollywood Remembers video. Today, we're going to pay a heartfelt tribute to the American stars we've recently lost, as well as other beloved figures around the world who have touched our lives. Before we begin, if this content resonates with you, please leave a like. It helps the channel continue bringing you tributes made with respect and care. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin.
Robert George Hurst has died at the age of 70. He was an Australian musician from Camden, New South Wales, and one of the founding members of Midnight Oil. For decades, Rob Hurst sat behind the drum kit, providing the pulse that carried the band's sound, along with percussion and steady backing vocals that grounded every performance. His passing marks the loss of a musician whose work reached far beyond the stage. From the 1970s through the band's hiatus in 2002, Hurst helped shape a sound that was unmistakably Australian. The drums were never flashy for the sake of it. They were strong, relentless, and purposeful. You felt them in your chest. You felt them in the message. Midnight Oil's music spoke to people who wanted honesty, songs that didn't shy away from hard topics, songs that felt urgent, like they mattered. And through it all, Rob Hurst was there, keeping time, holding the line, letting the songs breathe while driving them forward. If you ever watched the band live, you know what he brought. That locked-in focus, that physical, hard-working style, the kind of drummer who plays like the song is a responsibility, not just a performance. And fans noticed. Musicians noticed too. He came from a small town, but his work traveled the world. Still, there was always a sense of home in the rhythm, something grounded, something real. For fans, his playing is part of the soundtrack of their lives. For fellow musicians, it's a lesson in restraint and power. And now what remains is the echo of those drums, still rolling on, long after the final note.
Terrence "Chet" Brooks has died at the age of 60. He was a former NFL safety, a two-time Super Bowl champion with the San Francisco 49ers, and a proud standout from Texas A&M. He passed away after a battle with cancer. Before the championships and the bright lights of the NFL, Chet Brooks made his mark in college football. At Texas A&M, he wasn't just a key part of the defense, he helped define it. He's widely credited with coining the nickname Wrecking Crew, a phrase that came to represent toughness, discipline, and a defense that played with purpose. That name still carries weight today. In the NFL, Brooks brought that same edge to the field. As a safety with the 49ers, he was part of teams that reached the very top of the sport. 2 Super Bowl titles followed, not because he chased attention, but because he did his job, every snap, every assignment, the kind of player teammates trusted. He was the kind of defensive back who understood leverage and angles, not just hitting, but timing, communication, being where you're supposed to be before the ball even gets there. That's the quiet craft of a safety, and it's why coaches value players like that. Chet Brooks is remembered not just for rings or slogans, but for the standard he set. A defender who understood the game, a teammate who belonged to something bigger than himself. What remains is his impact, still felt in locker rooms, in traditions, and in the pride of the programs he helped build.
Patsy King has died at the age of 95. She was an Australian actress and children's television presenter, remembered for a long and steady career across theater, radio, and television. News reports say she passed away after a short illness. To audiences around the world, Patsy King was best known for her role as Erica Davidson, the original governor in the cult television series Prisoner. It was a role that helped set the tone for the show from the very beginning, calm on the surface, firm when needed, and quietly commanding. Her performance gave the series a sense of authority and realism that stayed with viewers long after her time on screen. In Australia, her work reached far beyond that single role. She was a familiar and trusted presence in children's television, as well as a respected performer in radio and on the stage. She belonged to a generation of actors who learned their craft the hard way. Long hours, live performances, no shortcuts. Colleagues remembered her as professional and prepared, someone who understood the responsibility of the work, especially when performing for young audiences, someone who took it seriously. Patsy King's career spanned decades, touching many corners of Australian entertainment. What remains is the memory of a performer who showed up, did the work, and left behind characters that still feel real, even now.
Reba McEntire is more than a country music icon, more than record sales, chart positions, or a crown earned over decades. Her story is about endurance, about identity, about learning how to stay soft in a life that demanded strength early and often. This is not a story about fame. It's a story about becoming. Reba McEntire was born in McAlester, Oklahoma, and raised in a working ranch family where discipline wasn't optional. Her father, Clark McEntire, was firm, demanding, and deeply shaped by responsibility. Work came first. Emotion came later, if at all. Her mother, Jacqueline Smith, offered the balance. She believed in music, expression, and the quiet power of encouragement. Reba grew up between those two forces, structure and tenderness, expectation and belief. That contrast mattered. It formed the way Reba learned to move through the world, tough enough to survive it, sensitive enough to feel it. Music entered her life not as a dream of stardom, but as a tool, a place to put feeling. Singing became a way to process what wasn't always said out loud. She learned early that her voice could hold stories, pain, joy, other people's lives, and in doing so, it protected her. It gave her purpose before she ever understood success. The first rise came steadily, not explosively, performing with her siblings, local shows, small stages, no shortcuts. When Nashville finally noticed her in the 1970s, the climb accelerated. Singles charted. Her name became familiar. Her sound, clear, emotional, grounded, stood out in a genre built on truth. Recognition followed, but it didn't erase the discipline she grew up with. If anything, it reinforced it. The success came quickly enough to feel real. Grammys, radio dominance, a growing presence that couldn't be ignored. But underneath it, Reba was still that girl shaped by two opposing forces. The one who worked relentlessly, and the one who felt deeply. That tension never left her. It became the engine. Before she was called the Queen of Country, she was learning how to hold success without losing herself, how to stand in the spotlight without forgetting where she came from, and how to use her voice not just to entertain, but to tell the truth, even when it hurt. This chapter isn't about triumph yet. It's about foundation. By the early 1980s, Reba McEntire was no longer just promising. She was unavoidable. Her voice carried authority now. Not loud authority. Lived-in authority. The kind that comes from experience, not confidence alone. This part of her story is often summarized with numbers, chart positions, awards, milestones, and yes, they matter. Over 100 singles on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, 25 number ones, millions of records sold. But those numbers don't explain why people listened. They don't explain why her songs stayed with them. What made Reba different was not power. It was empathy. While much of country music leaned on archetypes, Reba leaned into people. Her songs sounded like conversations overheard in kitchens and pickup trucks. Women at breaking points, men who didn't have the words, families holding together by routine and pride. She didn't perform these stories from above. she stepped into them. This was the era when her rise accelerated. Faster tours, bigger venues, a calendar that barely breathed. On the outside, it looked like a rival. On the inside, it required precision. Reba was known for preparation, rehearsed, controlled, professional to the core. That discipline traced straight back to her upbringing. You didn't coast. You earned your place every night. But success has weight. And the structure around her life wasn't always built to carry it. Behind the scenes, business decisions piled up. Trust was placed where systems should have been. The success came fast, but the foundation wasn't always secure. At one point, despite the visibility and acclaim, Reba found herself financially strained. Not ruined, but vulnerable. The kind of vulnerability that forces clarity. There was no public collapse, no scandal, just a quiet reckoning. A realization that talent alone doesn't protect you. That growth requires learning new roles, not just repeating old ones. What followed wasn't a retreat. It was a recalibration. Reba began taking more control over her business, her direction, her choices. And around the same time, something else shifted. She expanded into television and film, not as a vanity move, but as exploration. Acting allowed her to access emotion differently, to sit in silence, to let moments breathe. It changed her as an artist. The Reba of this period wasn't chasing relevance. She was building range, learning how to last. And slowly, without announcing it, she was preparing for the most important transition of her career, not into a bigger spotlight, but into a deeper one. This session isn't about domination, it's about adaptation. By the 1990s, Reba McEntire had already proven everything she needed to prove as a singer. The voice was established. The hits were undeniable. The crown, whether she asked for it or not, was already hers. What came next wasn't about expanding her resume, it was about expanding herself. This is where the shift becomes visible. Acting wasn't a side project. It was a release valve. Music had always allowed Reba to tell stories, but acting asked something different. It required stillness, listening, letting emotion sit without being carried by melody. For someone who had spent her life performing strength, this was unfamiliar territory. And it mattered. Her move into television wasn't about reinvention, it was about alignment. When she stepped into roles that reflected real-life complexity, women balancing work, motherhood, disappointment, humor, and resilience, audiences responded instantly. They didn't see a singer pretending to act. They saw someone who understood the weight of ordinary life. At the same time, her personal life was changing. Marriage, motherhood, responsibility. These weren't pauses in her career. They were pressures running alongside it. Reba carried them quietly. She didn't market her pain. She didn't turn vulnerability into spectacle. She just kept showing up. That balance came at a cost. The more successful she became, the more she felt the pull to be everything to everyone. The perfect professional, the dependable partner, the steady presence. That instinct to hold things together had been shaped long before fame. And it worked. Until it didn't. This period of her life wasn't defined by collapse. It was defined by strain. The kind that doesn't break you publicly, but slowly asks harder questions in private. Who are you when the schedule stops? When the applause fades? When the role you play for others no longer fits? Reba didn't answer those questions loudly. She adjusted. She simplified. She chose projects with meaning, not just reach. She leaned into stories that reflected emotional truth rather than image. And in doing so, she gained something rare in entertainment: longevity with credibility. By now, She wasn't chasing relevance. She was curating a life, one that allowed room for growth, mistakes, and quiet wins. The crown stayed, but it sat lighter. Because it was no longer the point. This chapter isn't about expansion, it's about integration. By the early 2000s, Reba McEntire entered a phase that looked calm from the outside. The pace slowed just enough. The work became more selective. To many, it seemed like stability. But internally, this was one of the most demanding chapters of her life. This is where success stops being the challenge, and meaning takes its place. Reba had spent decades mastering performance. She knew how to deliver, how to lead a room, how to carry responsibility without complaint. But now, life asked her to sit with things that couldn't be solved by discipline alone. Loss, change, letting go of identities that once felt permanent. Her marriage ended after many years, quietly, without spectacle. No public unraveling, just a shift that required recalibration. For someone whose instinct was always to endure, the real work became something else entirely. Acceptance, honesty, redefinition. Motherhood deepened during this time. Not as a headline, but as an anchor. Being present mattered more than being everywhere. Success no longer meant accumulation. It meant alignment. Reba began choosing peace in ways that didn't make noise, but changed everything. Artistically, this period brought a noticeable shift. Her voice carried more space, more restraint, less need to prove. The songs weren't about power anymore. They were about understanding, about distance, about forgiveness, sometimes without resolution. She also became something younger artists quietly watched. Not because she demanded attention, but because she modeled something rare. How to age in the industry without bitterness, without clinging, without disappearing. There was confidence here, but not the sharp kind. A softened confidence. One that comes from surviving enough to know you don't need to win every moment. Just the right ones. This chapter of Reba's life doesn't produce viral moments. It produces steadiness, the kind that only comes after storms. She became a reference point, not just for success, but for sustainability, for how to keep going without losing your center. And perhaps most importantly, she stopped performing strength for the sake of others. Strength became internal, private, real. This isn't the chapter people quote the most, but it's the one everything else depends on. In the later chapters of her life, Reba McEntire stopped measuring success by output. The albums, the shows, the recognition, they were already there. What mattered now was presence, who she was when the lights dimmed, when the work was done. She became something quieter and stronger because of it. A woman comfortable being a learner again, a mother, a mentor, someone willing to admit she didn't have everything figured out, even after decades at the top. That honesty reshaped her legacy more than any award ever could. The crown remained, but it no longer defined her. What defined her was resilience without hardness, grace without performance, the ability to evolve without erasing the past. Reba's story isn't about being the best forever. It's about becoming whole over time. And maybe that's the real reason her voice still matters. It doesn't just sing, it understands.